Thank you very much. I feel that after 3 hours of sex, not that I've just had 3 hours of sex, but after you've just had 3 hours of sex listening to it, my lecture is going to be a bit of a letdown. But I will try and spice it up, because I'm not going to go into that type of intimacy, but I am going to start with asking quite an important question, which is, why should we be interested in royal bedchambers? And the answer I'd give to that originates from a book that was first published in 1957 called The King's Two Bodies, which argued that medieval monarchs had two bodies. They had the body natural, their mortal body, their physical body, but they also had the body politic, which was their executive body, which contained policy and government in them. And I think we can say that certainly until 1688, or arguably perhaps even until 1714, English monarchs were the source of executive power and had these two bodies. We can debate perhaps whether that state ended in 1688, but essentially Stuart monarchs had the belief that they contained power divinely ordained by God to rule. And therefore, a sovereign who sleeps is both the person, but they are also a sleeping institution. And the room in which they sleep has the potential to be more than just a bedroom. It has the potential to be a seat of power. Well, I'm going to just actually roll back the clock and start what I'm going to say this afternoon in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, people had access to the monarch more or less the whole time. Here is the deathbed of King Henry VII. Now, this isn't probably an actual view, but the bed's reasonably convincing for 1509, and the people who are hovering around his bed are known to have been in his bedchamber. And what this illustrates is the great sense of openness that existed in medieval royal houses. So here's Windsor Castle. You will recognize it. It's much like this today. But here in this part of the upper ward here were the Royal Lodgings. And in particular, this L-shaped area here was the zone in which monarchs lived. And this is my reconstructed plan of Windsor Castle as it was at the beginning of the Tudor period. In other words, as it had been lived in by medieval monarchs. And what you will note is that once you've come up the Great Stair, you may or may not have gone into the Great Hall, walked along this gallery into an antechamber. Medieval kings essentially lived in three rooms: a great chamber, an audience chamber, and an extremely large bedchamber here, in which the king would sleep in a bed which was curtained round, and at the foot of which would sleep many of his closest and most intimate companions. And so these medieval bedchambers were full of the most important people in the realm, quite often sleeping on mattresses at the foot of the king's bed. And this situation really existed right up until the 1490s. And in the 1490s, with Henry VII on the throne, quite a substantial change happened in the way that royal bedchambers were organized. Because Henry VII built this structure, this tower at Windsor Castle, still there today. It contains the Royal Library. And this is the tower here, which is added on to that L-shaped series of rooms that I showed you before. Now, the reason he builds this tower is because he wants to create a new private zone within the Royal Palace, a zone which he could retreat from the large number of courtiers who surrounded a medieval king in traditional form. And this is the bedchamber that he creates here. And you can see that it is physically separated from the rest of the royal chambers. He retains a bedchamber here, which is sort of technically speaking the royal bedchamber at the end of the sequence, but it was possible to lock a door here and have an entirely secure and safe existence in this tower. Now, the mainspring for this quite substantial change that happened in the 1490s was a plot that the king discovered against his person, in which both his Lord Chamberlain and his Lord Steward were implicated. The Lord Chamberlain, person who's responsible for security in a royal palace, and the Lord Chamberlain who is responsible for the below-stairs activities. So Henry VII, shaken by this terrible plot, retreats into a tower, creating an entirely new situation for the first time in an English royal palace. Well, his son, Henry VIII, essentially carries on this arrangement, and this is my plan of Hampton Court in the early 1530s, soon after it was acquired by Henry VIII. You would come up through the Great Hall, into the outer chambers, and into the King's bedchamber here. But the King's bedchamber, and indeed the Privy Chamber next door, were a private zone into which only a very limited number of people were allowed. In fact, only people whose names were on an official list were allowed into the Privy Chamber and into the bedchamber beyond. And so, although there wasn't a physical barrier, as there was at Windsor Castle, as the king was locked away in a tower, there was an administrative barrier, a regulatory barrier, which prevented people going beyond this door and occupying this sort of private area. And even in the latter part of Henry VIII's reign, when these palaces were enormously extended, and I'm going to show you really the same plan, but in 1547, and you can see how much Henry VIII extends Hampton Court. You were just looking at this bit. That was the bedchamber. All of this stuff here is built on by the king. The arrangement is essentially the same. The king has a private bedchamber, which you could get access to if you were on the list, and there were probably about 40 people on the list towards the end of Henry VIII's reign. These people were allowed into the bedchamber, but it was still a highly restricted zone, and he's sleeping over here in this bottom corner of that courtyard. And so you can actually draw a diagram for the end of Henry VIII's reign that shows the sort of gradation of access, the increasing levels of privacy that existed in a royal palace. So almost anybody can get into the Great Hall. In the watching chamber stood the guards who were watching over the king's safety. The presence chamber was the place where various more public ceremonial happened. But at the door of the presence chamber, there was a barrier. And in this little gallery stood the guards with the list, determining who was allowed to penetrate into the Privy Chamber and the withdrawing room. This was known as the Privy Chamber. These two rooms together were called the Privy Chamber. And this limited number of about 40 people were allowed there. There was a second barrier here, which prevented anyone but a minutely small number of people, maybe half a dozen people, entering the king's bedchamber, his closets, and his Privy Gallery beyond. And it didn't really matter whether it was quite a small hunting lodge or whether it was a massive palace like Hampton Court or Whitehall. That was the formula that existed in the palaces of Henry VIII and was inherited by Mary and adopted by Elizabeth I. So, in essence, what Henry VII does is he separates the two bodies of the monarch. the body politic operates in these outer areas here, and the body corporal exists in these areas in a sense of privacy. Now, of course, in 1603, England had a change of dynasty, and we have to remember that King James VI of Scotland, other than a brief visit to Denmark, where he stayed in Cromberg Castle, had never been to England. And so as he crossed over the border and the great guns of Berwick welcomed him, and as he made his way south on the Great North Road, he was experiencing buildings and a way of life for a monarch that was actually very different from what he was used to in Scotland. Here, there he is, just to remind you, and here is Holyrood House, principal residence of the Scottish monarchs just outside Edinburgh. Of course, it was, today Edinburgh has sort of swallowed it up, but it was actually at a distance, more like sort of St. James's from Westminster. So here we see the tower in which James VI of Scotland lived. And here's my reconstruction of the way that palace was. There's the tower I just showed you with those two big drums. There was a staircase in the inner court which led to an outer chamber where the guards stood. And then there were essentially 3 rooms which led on to his bedchamber. This was a completely different arrangement to the arrangement that Queen Elizabeth I had. Not barely a single one of Elizabeth I's 50 or so royal houses had only 3 rooms. And the access that James's courtiers had into these rooms was very great. He had 24 bedroom servants, and they all had free access into all of these rooms, as did indeed many of his courtiers. And so when James came to England, we have a clash of court cultures. We have the architecture and the protocol of access, which is what exists in Scotland, clashing with the architecture and protocol of control and restriction, which is what you get in England. And so it's a really unusual situation. And James I very quickly realizes that these vast royal houses with hundreds of rooms are not at all to his taste. He finds them big, complicated, confusing, and he spends most of his time in a completely new type of palace that he invents. And quite early in his reign, he makes an announcement that he is going to divide his royal houses into 2 types. He is going to have the palaces of necessity and the palaces of state. And the palaces of state were places like Whitehall and Hampton Court, which he had to have for big diplomatic ceremonials and big court occasions, but he preferred to live in what he described as palaces of necessity. And the necessity was only people who it was absolutely necessary to be there were allowed in. So a very small number of people. And this is my reconstruction drawn for me. I hasten to add, this is not one of my drawings, by Stephen Conlon, which shows the palace that James I built at Royston. And this was a house of necessity. These are the King's Lodgings. It is, in fact, his most popular residence. He spent more time in Royston than anywhere else. And it is a house which contains 3 rooms. This here is the Great North Road. This is the A1. This is the motorway, the principal north-south motorway of Jacobean England. And the house is in the middle of the road. And if you go to Royston today, you will find that it still exists, this building, but the front of it has been sliced off. The back of it survives because they needed to widen the road to go through. But James I lives here. He appropriates all these little houses here. This one still exists. It's a fish and chip shop. And there are various other buildings that still exist in Royston, and James living in something that today we would regard as being far from palatial. And in it, of course, he has his bedchamber, which is open and accessible to this group of people who he regards as being necessary around him. Now, James married a Danish princess, Anna, and she came down to England with him, and in the long tradition of English queen consorts, she was assigned her own royal palace in London. So the monarch, James I, had Whitehall, where he lived, and Anna of Denmark had what became Denmark House, but was originally called Somerset House, and is where Somerset House is today. And Anna completely rebuilt it. James, as you can see from this, was not particularly interested in building or architecture, but Anna is, and she, in fact, builds the largest and most expensive royal building of the whole of the first part of the 17th century at Denmark House. And here she is. You can see, she has a great sense of her own regality. She's independently royal, of course. And in this, the right-hand picture, you can see in the background an illusionistic building, royal palace, which doesn't actually relate to anything that was built. This is what she did build, and this is my reconstruction of Somerset House. And you can see just at a glimpse that this is no three-room Scottish royal house. This is much more like what the English are living in. So you have a great hall, and then a series of outer chambers leading to some private rooms here. And the important point about this is that she builds two bedchambers. She builds a great bedchamber, and then a little bedchamber, a lesser bedchamber, separated by some closets. And so Anne is not at all keen on this free-for-all, rough-and-tumble, open access arrangement that her husband has, and arranges her own house in such a way that allows her to retreat from the court into these private areas and indeed into the whole of this private zone here without anyone getting in her way. Now, when in 1625 Charles I comes to the throne, he, rather like his mother, is pretty appalled by the court of James I. He really reacts very violently to this rather undignified, chaotic court. He dislikes the sort of sexual innuendo and license. He thinks it's all very undignified. And this view he has is reinforced by a trip he made in 1623 to Spain. In the early 1620s, debate began about who Charles I should marry. And the favoured candidate was the Infanta of Spain, a lady called Maria Anna, and negotiations began between the English and the Spanish to try and come up with a marriage treaty. The Pope issued a dispensation for it to happen because, of course, Charles was a Protestant and Maria Anna was a Roman Catholic. But the negotiations dragged on, and eventually Charles I, completely fed up with waiting and seized with a sort of sense of chivalry, decided to get on a horse and dash across Europe and try and rescue her from the clutches of her brother, King Philip IV of Spain. And it was an extraordinary, risky enterprise. It was the middle of winter, it was Lent, he only went with 4 people. He had to be in disguise, so he wore a false beard and a false wig. Very originally, he called himself Mr. Smith, so that he was unrecognizable. And he went to Paris, and then he got on a horse, and he rode 500 miles with just four of them, rode 500 miles, and arrived completely unannounced at the front door of the English ambassador in Madrid. And, you know, there are some times when you think you'd like to go back and see the look on people's faces. That is definitely one of them, when the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Buckingham, the King's favourite, turn up at the Spanish court. And so this is the Alcazar of Madrid, the headquarters of the Spanish monarchy. This facade was put on a few years before Charles arrived, but the royal lodgings are actually largely in the medieval part here, and Charles stays in some rooms at this bottom left-hand corner here. And this is my reconstruction plan of the Great Palace. And the important part about this is that Charles was invited to stay in the Philip IV's palace on equal terms as the Spanish king. Because what James I had cunningly done is he had given Charles a letter that said that he was the crowned king of Scotland. Now, absolute nonsense, he wasn't crowned anything, but he gave the impression that he was a monarch, and therefore he had to be treated exactly the same as the French king. And so he stayed in some rooms just below this corner here. This little staircase here led down to the Prince of Wales's rooms. This is the Spanish king's study. This is his bedroom. This is his picture gallery area here. But this palace is arranged much more like a Tudor royal palace, because the public rooms are up here, approached by the grand stair. But at this point here, there is an absolute barrier. And really, Philip III and Philip IV lived in this part of the palace in real extreme privacy, in extreme dignity, with order. And Charles was hugely influenced by this. Extraordinary contrast with the chaos of the English court. And he stayed 8 months there. This wasn't a sort of weekend mini break. He actually stayed for 8 months being suffused with the dignity and order of the Spanish court. And so when he comes back to Whitehall, you see this is my reconstruction of Whitehall in the early 17th century. This is about as close as you can get, I think. He imposes rules and regulations that Elizabeth I would recognise, but I think perhaps more importantly, the rules and regulations he had experienced at the Spanish court. And what that meant was that the outer rooms of the Tudor palace, these areas here, were still quite free and easy of access. But at this door here, there was an absolute shut-off. And these rooms, you can see all the way up here, this is the Privy Gallery, and this whole area here were kept exclusively privately for Charles I. And his bedchamber, and this room here, I think that's right, yeah. Next door to it in 10, this room here, was absolutely off limits to everyone apart from an extremely small number of people. And you can see the way the bedchamber links onto these rooms here. These are his collections cabinets, and those of you who are interested in 17th century art will know that this is where his incredible art collection was kept, accessed directly from his bedchamber, inaccessible to anyone else at court. And then there was a doorway into this incredible picture gallery, which was hung with the creme de la creme of his picture collection, both the contemporary stuff by Van Dyck and others, but also the earlier Renaissance paintings too. So Charles reinvents, refashions, reforms Whitehall to be this place of dignity, order, and indeed privacy. But of course, the Spanish match, as we all know, didn't come off, and he ended up marrying a French princess. And there she is, Henrietta Maria. And Henrietta Maria came from an entirely different tradition from the English court, rather like James coming from Scotland. She is the sister of a French king. She's been brought up in the Louvre. And French royal bedchambers are really fundamentally different from those of the Tudor period in England, because in a French royal bedchamber, the French king would receive people, give an audience, would sign a treaty, would make proclamations. The chambre de parade, the principal bedchamber, was effectively a public room with a bed on a platform with a rail around it, being kind of like a sort of more sort of a sacred object. And that is what Henrietta Maria was used to. And the French beds were of a very particular form with particular type of upholstery, and the rails around them also were very sort of characteristic. And so what Henrietta Maria does when she comes to the English court is she introduces into her buildings the French bedchamber. And so this is Somerset House, which you've already seen this plan, which is where Henrietta Maria lives. But what she does is she arranges her bedchamber here with a French bed. Her bed is put onto a platform. It is surrounded by a rail. It is cut in the French style, a very sort of boxy style. And when Charles II goes to Scotland on the two occasions he goes up there, she actually receives the Privy Council in her bedchamber, much more in the French fashion than in the English. And we have one precious illustration that illustrates this, and that is this here, which shows a room at St. James's Palace. It's the room set up for the visit of Henrietta Maria's mother, Mary de' Medici, who was the mother-in-law from hell, who came just before the Civil War and undoubtedly contributed to it happening, and stayed really pretty uninvited in London at vast expense at St. James's Palace. And of course what she did was she brought with her her own bed and her own bed rail and everything. And here you can see it. You can see the bed rail. It's not obviously on a platform there, but it was on a platform. And you can see her receiving people in her bedchamber. This is not in any sense a private room. And we have this also. Now, this is a really fascinating object, which, when I first was introduced to it in the late 1980s, was thought to be a bed rail, a gilded bed rail from coming round a bed, dating from Charles II's reign. The current view is that it may well date from Charles I's reign, and in fact, it may be one of those bed rails that went round Henrietta Maria's beds, but we don't know, but that may well be what it is. So there's something completely different happening in the Queen's Palace to what is happening at Whitehall. But the key development in royal bedchambers in the early 17th century doesn't happen at Whitehall or at Somerset House. It happens at Wimbledon Palace. What, you say? Wimbledon Palace? Where the hell's that? Well, it doesn't exist anymore, so you can be forgiven for not knowing. But one of the big discoveries of, actually, I haven't yet started really flogging my book, but of my new book, which came out last month, which wasn't written when you asked me to come and give this talk, the big discoveries is that this palace, which was bought by Henrietta Maria in 1639, is the seminal building for understanding the development of the royal bedchamber in England. So the building, as you can see, is actually an Elizabethan building. It was built by Thomas Cecil, Lord Burleigh, in about 1588. But in 1639, it was bought by Henrietta Maria for £17,000. This is a lot of money. I think the banqueting house in Whitehall only cost £20,000 to build. So £17,000 is absolutely huge amount of money. And it's bought at a time when there are some important developments in bedchambers in France. Because from the 1620s, aristocratic bedchambers become more private, become more intimate spaces. And they develop an arrangement whereby there is a little area between the bed and the wall known as a ruelle. And this ruelle, this little space, eventually develops into an alcove, a bed set within an alcove. And as far as we know, the first of these aristocratic alcoves was erected at the Hôtel du Rambouillet in Paris in the 1630s. And by the 1640s, really these alcoves are almost everywhere. So how does that relate to what's happening in Wimbledon? Well, I've been able to reconstruct, actually very accurately, the plan of Wimbledon Palace. And it's a fascinating place because it is essentially the ultimate love nest. It is a small, intimate palace with no public rooms, no state rooms. It is a retreat designed for Henrietta Maria and Charles I to go to with their family to get away from it all. And there is a traditional great hall and a chapel, a gallery here which leads out into a beautiful terrace with amazing gardens, and you saw in the previous slide it's set in gardens. But the King and Queen live in this area here. They have their own drawing rooms which are conjoined. They have an amazing his and hers bathrooms, which are tiled with lead-lined baths with hot and cold running water. But they have this extraordinary bedchamber. This is a cruciform room, a cross-shaped room, in the end of which there is an alcove which contained a large French red velvet bed trimmed with gold and silver. And this extraordinary arrangement led out on the same level here straight into the gardens. There's a little sort of security room here so that someone can make sure that nobody comes in. Sorry, there's a security room there. But this is the royal bedchamber set in an alcove. And so, at exactly the moment when in Paris these alcove bedchambers are coming fashionable, Henrietta Maria builds the first alcove bedchamber at Wimbledon in England. But it was clearly very much in the mind of Charles I and Henrietta Maria because at the same date that Wimbledon Palace is being built, Charles is commissioning a new palace at Whitehall. And this is what he has designed for him. When you think that this is designed to incorporate the banqueting house and that is the banqueting house, you will see what an ambitious plan it was, particularly for a man, and we only know this from hindsight, who was just about to go into a bloody civil war that he was about to lose. But you can see that there was a great outer court. This area here would have all been built in what is today St. James's Palace, St. James's Park. But what I want you to look at is the bedchambers. And the King's bedchamber is here, and I think you can see that there is a sort of alcove arrangement there. You can see a couple of pillars, and the bedchambers now, once you see that, are quite easy to spot right the way through this plan, and each of the King, the Queen, the Prince of Wales, you can see there's another one there, they were all given, in this new plan, these fashionable alcove bedchambers. But there's an absolutely key point to make here. The whole point about the alcove bedchamber was it gave you an ability to use your bedchamber as a private and an intimate space. The alcove bedchamber being imported from France was nothing to do with adopting French royal bedroom etiquette and using your bedroom as a public space. It was all about reinforcing the private and the intimate nature of it. Now, as we all know, the monarchy was abolished, the crown jewels were melted down, most of the palaces were sold, and by the end of the decade, without a king, England was ruled by Oliver Cromwell, a man who was effectively a king in everything but name. He used Whitehall in more or less exactly the same way as Charles I had, and as his country residence, he used Hampton Court. And this is a sort of more sort of diagrammatic representation, as far as we understand it, of how Hampton Court was in the reign, well, we could say the reign of King Oliver. And what I think is fascinating is that he decided to use not the king's apartments, which were up here, which I think he must have felt a bit uncomfortable about using. He decided to use the Queen's apartments, Henrietta Maria's apartments, and we know, because we have the accounts, that Henrietta Maria installed a French alcove bedchamber in her bedchamber here in 1638, which means that Oliver Cromwell, who we imagine as this austere person carrying a Bible and, preaching God's word, was actually sleeping in a French alcove bedchamber in Hampton Court that had been built by Henrietta Maria. So what did happen to Henrietta Maria? Well, after the royal court went to Oxford, where it held out for some years during the Civil War, Henrietta Maria, who was pregnant, moved from there, moved to Exeter, and eventually in 1644 fled to France, where she was welcomed with open arms, because after all, she was a member of the royal family. She was the aunt of Louis XIV, so she's absolutely a major figure. And not long after, 2 years later, the Prince of Wales, Charles, also flees to France. So where do they live? Well, when in 1644 Henrietta Maria comes, Louis XIV is not living in the Louvre, and Henrietta Maria is given the Louvre. So here is the Louvre, here's the Grand Gallery, here's the Tuileries and the Tuileries Gardens, and this is the corner of the Cour Carrée, which is actually the bit which they're living in, and Henrietta Maria is given 30 rooms in the Louvre. And she is given a substantial allowance by Louis XIV to establish herself, and she holds court. So here we have, this just shows you where I'm going to show you the detailed plan. So this is the corner of the Louvre where they're living, and this is the corner, and you can see here the way the two apartments, the King's apartments, the Queen's apartments join, and you can see the French arrangement of the chambre de parade, which contains the sort of state bed for public ceremonies, and the more private bedchamber or bedchambers, which the monarch actually slept in. And so here we have, first of all, Henrietta Maria, and then the future Charles II establishing themselves in the Louvre and living there. Well, after the execution of Charles I, and when the Prince of Wales becomes formally Charles II, Henrietta Maria and Charles II move from the Louvre, and Louis XIV moves in, and we won't go into French history. You're going to have all that tomorrow morning, I think. And they move to the Palais Royal, which you see here. Now, of course, we have to remember that the Palais Royal is the most modern, the most fashionable, large palace in Paris, built by Cardinal Richelieu and given to the crown in 1636. And so the future Charles II moves into what is arguably the most fashionable building in Northern Europe. And here we see a plan of it. And he's living with his mother, which was it can be a bit tricky living with your mother. My mother's not, obviously, but, Henrietta Maria was a very tricky mother to live with, let me tell you. But she's living in this wing here, and Charles II is living here. And what he has is essentially two parts. This area here, which is the more public part, and in here, he has a chambre de parade with a bed alcove. Can you see the bed alcove? I've drawn the bed in there with a little cross on it. So he has this very magnificent public chambre de parade with a bed alcove. And then going this way, he has more private rooms and has another bedchamber, also with an alcove in it here. And we don't have an actual illustration of the actual alcove there, but this is from a pattern book. These pattern books were produced, lots and lots of them, in the mid-17th century, and you sort of could pick your alcove and have your carpenter build it, and you can see a typical one there with a rail and one of these French beds behind it. And just one last point before we leave France, just to note that the surviving royal alcove bedchamber in the Louvre, which has been moved around, it's a really bad photograph and it's really badly, really difficult to see, and it's not, in my view, it's not much appreciated by the Louvre because it's a really important room. But this royal alcove, which you may well be familiar with, very well known, wasn't built until after 1654. So it wasn't built until after Charles II had left. So his experiences of these French alcove bedchambers were from the Palais Royal. So in 1660, Charles II returns to England. He actually arrives on his 30th birthday. He walks into Whitehall. There he is, and you can see Whitehall in the background. And he returns to the rooms in which his father had lived, because they'd barely been altered during the Commonwealth. But the first thing he does is build an alcove bedchamber in this room here. I mean, actually, when you open the big bound volumes of building accounts, the very first thing he's commissioning is this new bedchamber. We don't have an image of it, but what we do have is this in Powys Castle, the only surviving early 17th century alcove bedchamber in the UK. And the one in Whitehall Palace was larger than this, but was very, very similar and closely modelled on the ones that he would have experienced in the Palais Royal. And who knows, I mean, he may well have even brought back with him those books of patterns which were copied by the Royal Office of Works. The only bit of the Whitehall bedchamber to survive is this rather extraordinary apotheosis of Charles II that's now in the museum at Nottingham. And I do love it, actually. It does make me laugh because it's got this brilliant device of a flying oak tree carried by naked putty up into the heavens, like some deified object. And of course, as you all know, there was nothing more that Charles II liked to do than to tell at great length the tale of him hiding in the oak tree and escaping after the Battle of Worcester. It was a bit like, I suspect, Casanova escaping from the Doge's palace. You know, it got more and more elaborated as things went on. So in 1660, the alcove bedchamber was the big thing, and there were a number of commissions to replace some of the palaces that had been destroyed during the Civil War. And the most important of those commissions in the early 1660s was for a new royal palace at Greenwich. Greenwich, of course, the most important of the Tudor royal houses in the East, really completely wrecked during the Commonwealth. And this is the plan that was drawn up by John Webb, two wings, one big wing here with a massive chapel on it. This is the residential wing, and easy to identify, the royal bedchamber with its alcove. And that's, in fact, what was built. It's there today. You can see it. And here's my reconstruction of the way it was arranged. And you can see here the Royal Bedchamber. There's quite a lot more that you could say about this plan. But the point I want to make now is that the alcove was still all the rage. But it's quite interesting to see what happens after that. Charles II really spends the first decade of his reign at Whitehall. He makes a few trips out, and he discovers that he really likes Newmarket, where his grandfather had a house, and he commissions an architect called William Samwell to build him a residence there so he can go racing. And this is, again, by my friend Stephen Conlin, who did the Royston one, based on my research. And this sort of S-shaped building here is the Royal Lodgings. And this, Stephen's done a sort of cutaway here for me, so you can see the way it was organized. And you can see that actually, when he came to build this in 1669, two little columns there, but the alcove isn't really particularly prominent. And at exactly the same date as he is commissioning Newmarket, he's commissioning a new palace in Scotland. He's commissioning Holyrood House. And we know a great deal about this commission because, of course, it's being built in Edinburgh. Charles never goes to Edinburgh, so we have all the correspondence. So all the instructions are written down, and he's very explicit about the sort of bedchamber he wants. And again, here's my reconstruction of the plan of Holyrood House. And you can see there's absolutely no hint of any alcove there. And when you go there today, that room still exists with all its lovely plasterwork. There is no alcove. And by 1679, when he rebuilds Windsor Castle, again, when you look at the bedchamber here, there is no alcove. So it's gone. What happens? What's going on here? Well, early in Charles II's reign, the bedchamber is not a political space. It is for the body corporal. It is not for the body politic. He does invite some people into his bedchamber, but essentially, these early alcove bedchambers retain the idea of them being intimate space. But in the 1670s, 10 years into his reign, Charles enters into big trouble. And the big trouble is caused by the man on the right, who is his brother, the Duke of York, the future James II. Because this very silly man decides to put the whole of the Stuart Restoration at risk by declaring himself openly to be a Roman Catholic. Now, that would have been perfectly all right if Charles II had had a son, but by the 1670s it was quite clear that Catherine of Braganza was not going to give him a son, and therefore the Duke of York was going to be the next king. And only 10 years after England was an extreme Protestant republic, Parliament faced the prospect of having a Roman Catholic on the throne. And you may well be familiar with the politics of this, but there was a series of attempts by Parliament to exclude James I from the throne, which resulted in extraordinary disorder, violence, rioting in London, and really quite frightened Charles into feeling that he was somehow back in 1639, 1640, and there was going to be some sort of catastrophic revolution. And so what he does is he decides to assert his majesty, assert his divine right to occupy the throne. And he doesn't do it in London. He deliberately decides to move the focus of royal activities out of this dangerous, turbulent capital to a secure location upriver at Windsor. And he commissions Hugh May to build this remarkable set of state rooms. The grandest set of staterooms built in the 17th or the 18th century before George IV. You can see here St. George's Hall, which is one of the largest of the rooms. And in that reconstruction, he builds a new bedchamber of great magnificence. So what is all this about? Well, what it's about is Charles creating an entirely new setting for his rule. In the last 6 years of his reign, he changes all the court regulations, all the court etiquette, to reinforce the distance between him and his subjects. And part of that is transforming his bedchamber from being a private place into being a public room of reception in the French manner. And in the French manner, he institutes a levee and a coucher, formal ceremonies where he gets out of bed in the morning and dresses behind a rail with people watching him from behind and reversing that process in the evening. He begins to emphasize, to privilege the body politic over the body corporal, emphasizing that he is a person set apart by God to rule. And after the 1681 Parliament is dissolved, and there's a lot of politics there I'm not going to get into this afternoon, he actually decides to move the capital of England to Winchester. And this is another one of Stephen's brilliant drawings. This is the palace at Winchester that Christopher Wren designs and completes. It looks like that in 1685. They never got round to driving this avenue through the medieval city to align the palace on the cathedral, but that had been the plan if it hadn't been for the fact that Charles II died. But in this royal palace, which we have a plan of, the king's apartments are over here, and he has a bedchamber here, number 18, obviously no alcove. He has this bedchamber, which is designed as a room of state, a room in which he undertakes the state duties in exactly the same way as the French king. So let me just tie up the threads here and get to some conclusions. So from the Middle Ages, the royal bedchamber was essentially designed for the body corporal, in other words, for the private life of the monarch. But from the reign of Henry VII, the degree of access to it varies quite a lot. So Henry VII makes access to it extremely difficult, lots of physical barriers. Henry VIII removes the physical barriers, creates barriers of protocol to keep people out, and allows greater access. Elizabeth I tightens up access incredibly tight. She's the tightest of all. Nobody goes into the Queen's bedchamber, partly, of course, because she's a woman. James I allows a lot of access, but doesn't undertake any state activities, no body politic activities. Charles I then reduces it down again, locks everybody out, keeps it incredibly private. But Charles II, after experimenting with what he'd learnt in France in terms of the intimacy of the bedchamber, finally turns the English royal bedchamber into an assertion of might and majesty and power, indeed a tool for absolutism. And we have today, and this was an occasion when that bed rail was put up at Hampton Court. It's about as close as we can get to what Charles II would have known in terms of standing behind that rail and asserting his majesty. But this is actually also what William III inherits. But William III, although he has a levee and a coucher, does not use the royal bedchamber in the way that Charles II does at all. And so, really, the reign of Charles II is the high point, not only of divine right in English history, but it's also the high point of the English royal bedchamber, the brief moment, the brief 6 years indeed, in which the English royal bedchamber becomes a room of state and the centre of executive power. And, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to read about it all, you can read about it in my excellent book, on sale in all good bookshops now. Thank you.